but there's a privilege of growing older. You get to revisit yourself. You get to say, do I still believe this? Do I still want this? Does this still belong to me? You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to discover that the thing you once wanted isn't what you want anymore. You're allowed to create a life that isn't simply a recreation to the life you came from. And maybe your life doesn't need to be completely rebuilt at all. Maybe there are just parts of it that need to become more intentional. Maybe you need to make space for the creative part of yourself that you put aside. Maybe you need to stop living according to someone else's timeline. Maybe you need to let yourself be seen. Maybe you need to speak. Maybe you need to rest. Maybe you need to ask God what He is saying beneath all the noise. Maybe you simply need to stop long enough to notice, I actually created this life, and now I get to decide what happens next. Living Content Era 2 is for the person who's already on the journey and is ready to go even deeper. It's for the deeply reflective human who knows that the gap between external success and internal alignment is real and is no longer willing to paper over it. It's for the woman who holds a lot in her home, in her career, in her community, and is starting to ask harder questions about who is she beneath everything she carries. It's for anyone who is excellent in every room and quietly unsettled on the drive home. It's for anyone who has done enough living to know that who you are on the inside shapes everything that happens on the outside, and who wants to talk about it honestly, without performance and without pretending. Hello sis and the brother in the room. Hello family. Welcome back to another episode of Living Content Podcast. I do hope that last week you actually spent some time catching up with the rest of the episodes that you have not listened to. I was quite intentional to take that break. For many of you who are only hopping on this new episode and have not heard the last one, I literally decided to actually change something with the podcast that allows me to actually have time to breathe, to read, and to just calm down, to have rest. And last week there was no episode released, and this week this is the episode that we are releasing this week. But I do hope that you did catch up with the last episodes that you have not listened to. Before we get into today's conversation, I want to ask you something first. And honestly, from the bottom of my heart, I do want you to engage me on this one. The reason being is that I do see that a lot of you, yes, will sort of indicate that this resonates with you. And there's quite a few of you guys who have also reached out to me, which I deeply appreciate so much. Honestly, it helps me when I know and understand what works, what resonates, and how have these episodes been helping you. It not only helps me shape and bring to you the conversations that matters, but it tells me that someone at the end of this is also listening. Honestly, to know that there's someone listening, even though I do see the numbers do not matter. But when the person who's listening reaches out, it hits different. Even if there was just one person listening, to be honest, for me, when I know that that person is real, it always hits different. So before I start today's conversation, I really want to ask you a question. And please engage me on the comment section wherever you're listening to this episode, whichever channel. This is how we're going to start every episode going forward, so I can get you guys to talk, to chat with me, right? So the question I have for you before I start this conversation is, have you achieved something you once really wanted so bad? You wanted for a very long time in your life, only to realize that you don't actually want it anymore. I know it's a hard one. I had to even stop there, right? It can be a job, it can be a relationship, it can be a house, it can be a lifestyle, or even a job title that you wanted so much for a very long time, and then you get there and then you realize that you don't want it anymore. What is it? It can be a version of success you spent years working towards, and then you finally got there and thought, okay, now what? I want you to tell me in the comment section, whatever it is, tell me about that story. It doesn't have to be a big story, of course. Just tell me one thing you once wanted very badly, but somewhere along the way realized it wasn't actually what you wanted anymore. Because I think sometimes we don't realize that we can spend years building a life around a decision we made when we had very little choice in our lives, right? And then one day you wake up and realize that I built this life, but did I choose it? Did I choose this life that I've built entirely? So that is where today's conversation begins. Who is really leading your life? And I don't mean this in a traditional sense of leadership. I'm not talking about being the person in charge at work. Today's conversation really is talking about the quieter kind of leadership. The one that happens when nobody's watching. The decision you make, the things you tolerate, the dreams you pursue, the things you believe about yourself, the rooms you enter, the rooms you also choose to avoid, the way you respond when somebody doesn't like you, the way you respond when somebody does like you, the way you hear God's voice, the way you understand your own story, and ultimately, whether you're living from who you know yourself to be, or whether you're still being led by things that happened to you a very long time ago, or even just the things that are happening around you. Are you anchored? Do you know what truly still is leading your life today, or are you led by almost everything and anything around you and everything that anyone says about you? I've been thinking about this a lot because when I think about who is leading your life, I think about what shaped the idea of what you ended up becoming. And then I think about something even more important. Have you ever stopped to reevaluate what is still driving that story today? What is still driving that story today? Because remember, today you have the choice to reevaluate it. You might have not had the choice growing up. You might have not had the choice leading to this point you are at today. But have you taken time to reevaluate what is still driving that story? Because there's a difference between understanding why you became who you became and deciding who you want to become now and moving forward. And that distinction has become very personal for me. I've had to think about this quite deeply in my own life. There was a point where I realized that the ladder was leaning in the opposite direction. It was rather leaning on the side that when I got to the top of it, I realized that the view wasn't really what I wanted, or I didn't want that side of the building anymore. I had been climbing. I was doing what made sense. I was achieving. I was building a career. I was creating the stable life that I had always wanted, right? But eventually I had to stop and ask, what am I actually climbing towards? Where is this ladder leaning towards? Because I'm naturally a creative person. I didn't need to go to school to discover that. I've always loved creating. It has been something at the core of me that I'll do and lose track of time and enjoy for a very long time. I love writing. I love creating things with my hands. I had a macrame shop. I can literally joy from creating something that was never there to begin with. I get joy in expressing myself. There was always something in me that wanted to create, right? Even this platform, creating it from scratch. I work on the production part of it. I worked on the creative element, the marketing of it. Of course, at some point, I need to delegate those things so I can work on the strategic part of it, right? Creating was something that came innate to me. And I do believe in some shape or form it is innate in all of us and it looks different. But the artistic, creative element that I'm referring to was quite innate in me. But I also grew up as an A learner in my class. And when you are the child who does well academically, people naturally start seeing a certain future for you. They start recommending a certain future for you, a particular one that utilizes those things, right? You're good at maths, you're good at science, you work hard, you get good grades, you get good marks. So you study the subjects that are considered to have a clear future. And grew up in Soweto, I didn't necessarily grow up surrounded by endless possibilities or choices or options presented to me when it came to the different paths you could take. It was quite clear that there was only a few presented to you. There were certain careers that made sense given the circumstances that you grew up in. There were certain careers that were seen as stable, and certain careers that could change the trajectory of your life. So I did what made sense. I studied maths and science. I followed the obvious path. And dare I tell you, if I'm being honest, I don't regret it. Because I understand the girl who made those decisions. She was making the best decision she could with what she knew. As per the last episode, we spoke on forgiveness. And this part of me is not one that I necessarily need to forgive, but to thank as well. There's certain parts of us that we need to go back to and to thank, right? And honestly, what I wanted at that stage wasn't necessarily some grand vision of success. It wasn't a big idea. I wanted stability. I wanted a home I could call my own. I wanted a family. I wanted a stable career. I wanted to know that there would be food on the table, not every day, but for every meal as well. I wanted to live a life where I didn't constantly feel like I was surviving this life. And when you've grown with survival somewhere in your story, that makes complete sense. Having those dreams and ideas of what success looks like for you, it makes sense that it won't necessarily start as something big and grandiose, right? It will be as simple as stability, security, and safety. You don't necessarily dream about purpose at first. You dream about safety. You dream about enough. You dream about getting to a place where life isn't constantly asking you to fight. And I think there is something beautiful about that. But eventually, I reached a point where I had to ask myself, what happens when you've survived? When you've gotten on the other side of what initially was your dream? You are there now. What happens? What happens when you've built the stable life? What happens when you have escaped the thing that you were running from? Because there comes a point where you have to stop running away from one life and start intentionally creating another. And that was a very important shift for me. I had to stop asking, what do I need to do to make sure I don't end up there? And start asking myself a different question rather. What life do I actually want? Not what looks successful to everyone else. Not what proves that I made it. I finally made it. Because at some point, I think it's all about proving to someone, to something, and to yourself at times that I can do it. And it's all good. It's all good because it created that momentum for you to keep on going. But there comes a point where you've arrived, where you are there. And yet you have to assess with yourself whether you've lost yourself along the way. Where is yourself now? Because you can get to a point and look back and find that you left yourself behind. And find that you have been running alone, running from a particular life. But there's an emptiness and there's a gap between where you are and yourself. Where you've arrived at this point, but there is a lack of joy and peace in you. Because somehow you recognize that I have left myself behind. I've left that girl behind, right? I hope that makes sense. So you get to a point where you now ask yourself, not what makes sense on paper. What do I want? And that question sounds simple, but sometimes it's actually incredibly difficult. Because if you've spent most of your life responding to circumstances, you can become very good at doing what is necessary and very disconnected from what is actually yours. I think all of us deserve to reach a point where we get to choose, right? And I don't say this because life is always going to give us unlimited choices. Not at all. It won't. It actually won't give us unlimited choices. Some people are still surviving. And not to sound dark or anything, some people are still surviving today. Some people are still trying to create safety today. Some people don't have the luxury of asking themselves what they deeply desire because they are trying to get through the month. It's a beautiful place to be if you can ask yourself these questions. Some people don't have the luxury to ask themselves. But if you've reached a point where you have some room to breathe, if you've reached that point where you've created some stability, I think there is value in stopping, just stopping and witnessing what you've created. asking, not immediately asking, what's next? Just looking at your life and asking yourself, what did I create because I genuinely wanted it? What did I create because I was afraid? What did I create because I thought I was supposed to be at a certain point by a certain age? What did I create because I wanted to prove something? What did I create because it was my deepest yearning? And perhaps the most important question, how much of what I created is genuinely mine? Because sometimes we inherit dreams, right? We inherit definitions of success from everyone else. We inherit timelines. We inherit ideas about what a good life is supposed to look like. And we don't always question them. We just keep climbing until one day we realize the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. And this is where I think self-awareness becomes important. So important. Because how can you lead yourself if you don't know yourself? How can you lead yourself if you don't know yourself? How do you know whether you are making a decision because you genuinely want something or because you're afraid of falling behind? How do you know whether you're saying yes because it aligns with you or because you want to be liked? And how do you know whether you're working hard because you're ambitious or because you don't feel worthy when you're not achieving? You have to know yourself. You have to actually start there. And knowing yourself means being willing to look at the stories that shaped you. Being willing to look at the stories that shaped you. Some of those stories are beautiful. Some of them are painful as well. And some of them are simply no longer true today. One of those stories for me was being called ugly. I speak a lot about that on this podcast and also in my book. I've spoken about this before, but I think about it differently now. Because when I was younger, I didn't understand how something somebody said about me could follow me for so long. You hear something enough times, and eventually you stop hearing it as someone else's opinion. You hear it as a truth, as your truth. And I carried that. It affected how I saw myself, how I presented myself in rooms. And one of the ways it showed up was through visibility. Being seen became complicated for me. It became extremely difficult because if somewhere inside you believe that there is something wrong with you, then being visible becomes vulnerable. You start wondering what people are going to see or what they're going to say, what they are going to think about you, whether you're going to agree with the things you've already believed about yourself, or whether they're going to reinforce those ideas that are piling up in your head. Was happening. And I didn't always recognize that this was happening. I thought I was just insecure, shy. I thought maybe I wasn't naturally confident. But eventually I realized that there was a story underneath it. And that story needed healing. The same thing happened with my voice. There was another belief I carried. My voice didn't matter. And honestly, I don't know that it came from a one particular moment. Sometimes these beliefs are built slowly, from being interrupted, being overlooked, feeling like someone else has something more important to say, learning to stay quiet, and eventually you stop speaking before anyone even asks you to be quiet. You edit yourself, you question yourself, you make yourself smaller. And healing for me meant questioning that story, not replacing it with everyone loves my voice, because that isn't realistic if you think about it. Not everyone will like what I say. Not everyone will agree with me. But I had to get to a point where other people's opinions didn't determine whether I was allowed to speak or not. That is different. Healing didn't make everyone approve of me. It helped me stop needing them, stop needing the validation, and stop waiting for permission. And I think this is what owning your own story really means. It doesn't mean pretending your past didn't hurt. It doesn't mean saying everything happens for a reason. Because we tend to use that quite a lot, that everything happens for a reason. It's okay to not force the meaning if you can't see it. And moving on before you've actually processed what happened. It means being able to say, this happened to me, it shaped me, I understand what it did to me, and I get to decide what happens with it now. And that's really what we call ownership, right? you owning your own story. Because when you own your story, people have less power to use it against you. There isn't the secret part of yourself you're constantly trying to protect. You know where you've come from. You know what you survived. You know you're still healing, and you don't need to pretend. For me, the girl who was called ugly is still part of my story. The girl who thought her voice didn't matter is still part of my story. But neither of them get to lead my life anymore. I can honor who she was without allowing her fears to make my decisions today. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things about healing. You don't have to reject your younger self. You simply have to stop asking her to lead or asking her to show you the way. There's another part of this that has become increasingly important to me, and that is my relationship with God, because I've realized that self-awareness also affects how we hear God, right? There has been seasons where I've prayed for direction, but there was so much noise inside me. Fear was loud, very loud, that is. Comparison was loud, and other people's expectations were loud too. The pressure to achieve was loud. The fear of getting it wrong was loud. And then there was God's voice, steady, quiet, and not competing. I had to learn that sometimes the problem isn't that God isn't speaking. Sometimes I'm carrying too much noise to recognize what He's saying. And healing has helped me become quieter. Quiet enough to recognize when something is fear. Quiet enough to recognize when something is comparison. Quiet enough to recognize when I'm trying to prove something. And quiet enough to ask, is this actually what I want? Is this actually what God is asking of me? Or am I simply reacting to an old story? And that distinction matters, because not every thought deserves to lead you. Not every fear deserves your obedience. Not every opinion deserves your attention. And not every uncomfortable feeling means you're on the wrong path. Sometimes you're simply becoming someone you've never been before. So when I ask who is really leading your life, I'm asking you to look beyond the obvious. Look at your decisions. Look at your patterns. Look at the things you keep repeating. Look at the things you keep avoiding. Look at what makes you feel like you have to prove yourself. Look at what makes you shrink. Look at what makes you chase. Look at what makes you afraid to stop, to rest, to take a break. Because those things tell you a lot about what is actually leading you today. And I think self-leadership is being able to say, I know what shaped me, but I get to decide what leads me now. My childhood can shape me, but it doesn't get to lead me. Rejection can shape me, but it doesn't get to lead me. Being called ugly can shape me, but it doesn't get to lead me. The fear of being behind can shape me, but it doesn't get to lead me. Survival can explain why I built the life I built today. But now that I have some room to choose, I get to decide what I built next. And perhaps that's the real privilege of growing older as well, and growing wiser. Because growing older doesn't mean that there's maturity and there's wisdom as well, right? And I don't want to tease at some people, but growing older does not equate to wisdom. But there's a privilege of growing older. You get to revisit yourself. You get to say, do I still believe this? Do I still want this? Does this still belong to me? You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to discover that the thing you once wanted isn't what you want anymore. You're allowed to create a life that isn't simply a recreation to the life you came from. And maybe your life doesn't need to be completely rebuilt at all. Maybe there are just parts of it that needs to become more intentional. Maybe you need to make space for the creative part of yourself that you put aside. Maybe you need to stop living according to someone else's timeline. Maybe you need to let yourself be seen. Maybe you need to speak. Maybe you need to rest. Maybe you need to ask God what He is saying beneath all the noise. Maybe you simply need to stop long enough to notice, I actually created this life. And now I get to decide what happens next. So let me leave you with the question: who is really leading your life? Is it fear? Is it comparison? Is it survival? Is it an old version of you? Because sometimes our past successes can actually trap us. Do you know that? Not only fear, not only our failures, sometimes our past success can really trap us. Is it the need to prove yourself? Or are you becoming intentional enough to let your values, your healed self, and your relationship with God lead you? You don't need to have the answer today, but you do need to be willing to ask, because awareness is where choice begins, and choice is where self-leadership begins. As usual, I have journaling prompts for you. I want you to sit with 2 questions this week. 1, when I look at the life I have created, what parts were built from love, genuine desire, and my deepest yearning? And what parts were built from fear, survival, comparison, or the pressure to be somewhere by a certain age? And don't judge the answers. Don't judge yourself. Just notice. And then 2, what old story about myself is still influencing the way I show up today? What old story about myself is still influencing the way I show up today? Maybe it's my voice. Doesn't matter. I'm not beautiful. I'm behind. I'll have to prove myself. I have to be needed to be valued. Whatever yours is, write it down. Then ask. And then ask yourself, is this still allowed to lead me? Okay? And before we go, let's leave ourselves with a few affirmations. And maybe just putting your right hand at the center of your chest and your left hand at your belly. I hope that you're not driving, but if you're cooking, I'm sure you can put that aside, right? Just do that for me for a few seconds. Just do that for me. I want you to follow these affirmations with me. I know what shaped me, and I'm allowed to choose who I become. My past is part of my story, but it does not have to lead my future. My voice matters. I am allowed to be seen. I am allowed to take up space. I don't have to build my life around the fears that once kept me safe. I am allowed to live beyond survival. I am allowed to change my mind. I am allowed to create intentionally. I trust myself to question the stories I have carried. I am learning to recognize God's voice beneath the noise. I know what shaped me, and I get to decide what leads me now. Family, thank you for spending this time with me. I hope today's conversation gives you permission to stop for a moment and look at the life you've created. Not to judge it, not to dismantle it at all, no. Just to witness it. And perhaps ask yourself, how much of this is genuinely mine, right? Because there comes a point where we stop simply inheriting a life and start intentionally creating one. I'll see you in the next episode. Keep growing, keep evolving, keep becoming, and keep choosing yourself in the life that you deeply desire. And keep making your life sacred, because it is, sis. Because it is, my brother in the room as well. All right, family. I leave you here today. Take care of yourself. Cheers. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode. I really do appreciate you for being here. Please remember to share your love openly here by subscribing, sharing these episodes, and also just adding your feedback on the reviews. So this podcast can also be easily found by those in similar journeys and needing the message here. I would love to hear how the podcast is helping you. So do share that too with me, and be sure to check the podcast out on Instagram. Keep well. Chat to you soon.